Hi, this is Daniel Kremen, host of Kremen's Corner. And in this video, I'm going to give you my thoughts on the ensuing wildfire that has engulfed the Labour Party in the wake of the latest set of revelations about Peter Mandelson. Peter Mandelson, of course, being the former US ambassador and a former senior level Labour figure who served as business secretary under Gordon Brown and also was in the cabinets of Tony Blair and a major, sort of co-architect of the new Labour era. His relationship with the convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein, his dealings with him even after that conviction, are the source of a major political scandal now that is affecting Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour Prime Minister, could be the trigger point for the end of his premiership. As I speak on a Monday afternoon, the pressure is building on Sir Keir, and even some of his kind of closest media allies are now sort of asking serious questions about how long he can hold on. Even Pippa Creer, who these days is at The Guardian, previously of the Daily Mirror, very much a sort of a mouthpiece of progressive Britain and the Labour Party. Even she's saying, this is the fourth communications director now that Sir Keir Starmer has parted ways with in 19 months. Maybe the problems aren't the communications directors. The pressure has been building for a long time on Sir Keir, but this is the trigger point that could actually lead to a leadership change at the top of Labour. So look, I'm going to get into all of that and look at the nature of the difficulties Labour finds itself in beyond just purely this crisis as well, and give you my thoughts on what might happen next and what might come after Keir Starmer if he is indeed ousted, either in the very immediate future or in the coming weeks or months, particularly after the what are expected to be pretty brutal elections in May for Labour. So look, let's start with the reality that Sir Keir Starmer finds himself in. What happened? Well, look, Sir Keir, in opposition, had already lent into the sort of the Blairite wing, the Blairite faction of the Labour Party from about 2021, 2022 onwards, having initially sort of rejected a lot of the Blair era kind of policy legacy and ran as a candidate in 2020 saying he wanted to kind of preserve a much more soft left of centre kind of economic and social agenda that he was inheriting from Jeremy Corbyn. Sir Keir kind of actually started to junk a lot of those policies and move closer to what he construes as the centre ground. But certainly after an initially testy kind of period, he started to make more common cause with some of the senior Blairites, including Peter Mandelson. Now, Mandelson at one stage had actually speculated openly about the case for removing Sir Keir Starmer in 2021. But by late 2021, he was much more on side. And it was said that, he and a number of other kind of senior figures in and around the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, played an increasingly important role in preparing Labour for government in those sort of final years before the general election. Now, Peter had a checkered past politically, had to resign twice as a Labour minister, serving in Tony Blair's cabinets twice in the space of, I think, 2 or 3 years of one another. And then he obviously was given a kind of another redemption. He went out to the European Commission as their trades commissioner appointed under the Blair government. And he did, as people say, sort of reprieved himself to an extent in that role, was seen as one of the more competent members of, I think it was the Barroso Commission. I think it was Barroso. And then was plucked and brought back out of that and sort of brought back into the New Labour orbit, or rather said the Labour orbit was post-New Labour, really. This was Gordon Brown, who, very ostentatiously dropped the language of New Labour when he took over, when he forced Tony Blair out. He brought Peter Mandelson back in late 2008 when the panic stations were already on alert. Labour needed to kind of steady its position. And Mandelson was brought back in as the business secretary, and effectively a lot of people felt, the quasi deputy prime minister. And he played a role in those final months of final year and a half or so, really, of what was a pretty difficult economic and political period for the country in the wake of the kind of credit crunch. He was involved in all of that, but where the controversy kind of comes from is he was in correspondence through 2009 through 2010 with a guy he knew well, Jeffrey Epstein, who I think most people are aware of, is a highly toxic, contentious human being, who died in rather suspicious circumstances in a federal prison in America, I think awaiting trial for new accusations. Now, look, this guy was very dodgy, horrible man, but Peter Mandelson was kind of in contact with this guy, and from what we've seen in the past, there were revelations that he was urging him to fight his conviction and, keep fighting on for sort of a return and a redemption. But Mandelson was also, by all accounts, passing sensitive market information, political information, about things like an EU structural bailout fund, during a period of real fiscal instability. Stuff that can be bet on, stuff that people can take market positions around, was allegedly, we should say, because all of this would have to be proven in a court of law. He was passing some of this very sensitive information out to Epstein, and certainly, by all accounts, stayed in touch with him even after further revelations had kind of come to light. That's a relationship Peter Mandelson has since said, Lord Mandelson said, I deeply regret that kind of behaviour. But he, Lord Mandelson was a, both in his time in government and beyond it, was a very networked individual internationally. He co-founded a lobbying firm called Global Counsel, was very involved with it, that represents a number of foreign interests who take very active interest in the economic and political affairs of the UK, European Union and the US government. So this was always a contentious appointment when he was being asked to return yet again to public service as US ambassador. This was a contentious appointment, and the questions were being asked around the time of his appointment because the Epstein files, which is this huge repository of information, particularly email-based information that this horrendous man was keeping on his friends and his connections, Mandelson, we knew, was already featured in some of that. Now, Mandelson gave assurances that apparently to senior Labour figures that his relationship had stopped, that it was all in the past, that he had not continued on after the conviction, having a long-standing relationship with this guy. And of course, that appears to have all been blown out of the water by the revelations of extensive contact and of passing, as I say, market-sensitive information, and stuff about the nature of the government and about the players involved and about the period when the coalition government was being negotiated and Gordon Brown resigning. All of this stuff, passing this kind of information out. God knows what else is sort of passed out. But all of this, has kind of come to light, and it's confirmed what people were concerned about. Now, look, what Sir Keir Starmer has tried to do initially was say, look, I wasn't aware of this additional information. This should have been picked up by the vetting system. So he's tried to blame, effectively, the Cabinet Office, number 10 officials, probably by association people in the intelligence and security services who would be involved in some of this vetting process. He's tried to kind of initially pile the blame onto them. And over the weekend, when that hasn't worked, he's made the decision to part ways with Morgan McSweeney, who was his right-hand man as Chief of Staff, was the guy who ran his leadership campaign in 2020, who set up a think tank called Labour Together that developed a lot of the policies that are in the 2024 Labour manifesto, came into government with him. He soon found himself in a set two with Sue Gray, who was the initial chief of staff, that he won, and he was, very much seen as the more political of the two figures, the person who was more of a political street fighter, and he beat Sue Gray in that battle of wills, and took over the Number 10 operation, surrounded himself by all accounts with some very like-minded people. Now, the thing to know about McSweeney is he was very much sort of seen as an acolyte of Peter Mandelson, someone who listened to him and listened to other sort of senior, Blairite greybeards very intently. So it was said that, how would I put this? That McSweeney and a few others, like Jonathan Powell, who is the current National Security Advisor and was a chief of staff to Tony Blair, a very senior figure in the Blair government, that these two really were seen to be the people who were instrumental in pushing for Lord Mandelson to get this US ambassador post under Donald Trump. This meant that their positions, are untenable in a lot of people's views. McSweeney was already under a lot of pressure, was an unpopular figure with a lot of Labour MPs and commentators because of the difficult position Labour finds itself in electorally as well, and that sense of drift in the government, no strong narrative, departures from the manifesto commitments, a whole range of random policies appearing that don't seem to bear any recognition to what they were promising to do in the manifesto. So the operation was already seen as quite chaotic before all of this happened. But McSweeney has had to bite the bullet. He's been made to go. Tim Allen, who is another Blairite alumni, another person who is another sort of acolyte, a kind of protege of Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell back in the day in the late 90s and 2000s. He'd only been back for 4 or 5 months. He'd kind of come back in, the beginning of the political term as Starmer's fourth communications director in Number 10. And this was another guy who was, a really high-powered lobbyist that sort of set up Portland, which is a major public affairs and PR firm. He'd sort of, kind of made that decision to come back in after all of these years out of government, kind of help breathe new life into it. And he's been effectively, I think we would also shown the door. Now, he said he's resigned, but effectively shown the door as part of Starmer's desperate attempts to survive and sort of yet again reset another new phase in the government's lifespan under his leadership. Now, look, these departures, they're intended to kind of give the Parliamentary Labour Party their pound of flesh, to say, look, I've listened, I've learnt, I'm parting ways with these figures who were involved in, we're speculating on this, but all involved in Peter Mandelson being sort of rammed into post despite, there being concerns raised internally at the time. Is it going to be enough to save Keir Starmer's bacon politically? Is he going to be able to limp on and, try and recover in the coming weeks and months? It's hard to say with any definitive certainty that he'll be in post at the end of this week, in the sense of not having announced his resignation as Labour leader and precipitated a kind of a replacement process where he'd stand down as Prime Minister. I can't honestly look at you and tell you that I think he will be in post at the end of the week. I can't. And that shows you just how vulnerable the political position he is in. Just before I started recording this, the leader, Anas Sarwar of Scottish Labour, the Scottish Labour Party, he's giving a previously unscheduled press conference where it's believed he's going to be calling for Sir Keir to go. So the pressure is building publicly within the Labour Party. Over the weekend, we saw a score of briefings, different people saying, I warned Keir Starmer not to go with Mandelson. Lots of people in government, lots of people out of government, including his ex-deputy prime minister and deputy leader, Angela Rayner, who has clear ambitions to replace him, despite her own scandal. They're all jostling. David Lammy, who was the foreign secretary when Lord Mandelson was being appointed and who kind of went out to bat publicly for that appointment. He's now saying he had grave concerns, apparently, letting it be known through friends to the media that he wasn't on board with this. He's now, of course, Deputy Prime Minister, which is a non-constitutional position. It doesn't automatically follow that the Deputy Prime Minister would become the Prime Minister if Sir Keir walked away entirely from government, which is, not impossible. But Lammy is also trying to say I've got clean hands on this, and it's not very convincing, frankly. And Lammy is another kind of greybeard of the Labour Party who kind of goes back to the Mandelson days and actually served as a junior minister under Peter Mandelson at one stage. I understand it. So from memory. So in all of this, there's a kind of a bit of a battle now to apportion blame, and Sir Keir Starmer himself is trying to, effectively contain this and say nothing to do with my overall integrity. This was a mistake on my part. I listened to the wrong people. I've learned from that. I'll move on. Is it going to work? I'm not sure. My feeling is the best case for him is that he probably gets to sort of limp on till July, August. So he gets 2 years as Prime Minister, but a kind of a leadership contest to replace him at best is kind of deferred until after the May elections, which will be brutal. I think he's probably going to be gone by the start of the new political term in September and then party conference season. I think Labour may very well have a new leader and a new Prime Minister in place by that point. I think if he survives this week, then he probably will survive till May, unless something major more is revealed that kind of makes that position untenable. But it is possible he goes this week in the sense of having to resign as party leader and begin that process to replace him. It's entirely possible. Who would come after him? That's the other big question. Who might succeed him? Who are the kind of the leading contenders? Well, look, this is where Labour also has difficulties because, we're not talking, in my view, about a very strong field to begin with. And I say this as somebody who is, obviously quite partisan in the sense of supporting Reform UK and wanting to see reform the government. But I try to be quite level-headed and fair in my analysis. And so when I say I think Labour has a real talent problem in terms of who could replace him, who could do a better job, both as Prime Minister and in electoral terms for Labour, I'm not exaggerating. I mean, goodness me, I'm an ex-Labour Party member myself. I don't, absolutely hate the Labour Party in its entirety. There are good people that I know who are still Labour Party members and people in Parliament and so forth. So it's not a case of, of pure hyper-partisanship when I say that. What I mean by this is not a talented cabinet. This is not a particularly talented front bench. And there isn't somebody who really appears to have their pulse on the nation's kind of vibe, its feelings about what's going wrong. I'm not seeing any great depth of analysis coming forward on what Labour could do to fix its problems from the people who, want to inherit the crown potentially. So who are these figures? So Angela Rayner, we've mentioned already, is the former Deputy Prime Minister and former Deputy Leader of the Labour Party. Makes a great deal about her working class background, about being a single mother who fought her way up, sort of worked, I believe, in social care and then got involved in trade union politics and got a job out of that and kind of pushed her way into the Labour Party, kind of hierarchy and kind of climbed up it. Nothing against social mobility here, but I think a lot of us would say Angela Rayner was probably a good example of the Peter principle as Deputy Prime Minister, of somebody who reached a level that exceeded her competence. She came in with some big ideas around planning and infrastructure reform that really haven't happened. The detail wasn't worked out in opposition on what they wanted to do. Much of it hasn't really resulted in a higher level of house building or infrastructure to date. In fact, most of the indicators show a worsening picture, particularly for new housing starts. She obviously had to resign over the way that she was handling the stamp duty on the purchase of an additional property for herself in the summer. And that was a pretty bitter experience for her. And did no favours to the wider government and its internal political stability, because she was kind of containing the more left-leaning members of the Parliamentary Labour Party. They were kind of not rattling the cages of Downing Street because she was there, politically speaking. With her out of it, she's kind of feels she has nothing left to lose. She feels that her reputation was also being burnt on her way out the door by Sir Keir and by his political acolytes. So a lot of people feel that, and she's been signalling this in the Sunday and over the weekend papers, I believe, that she's ready to stand and ready to take him on and to publicly challenge. Whether that actually happens, we'll see. But nobody wants to be the one who's sort of seen to wield the knife. They want to benefit. He or she who wields the knife rarely gets the crown, as they say. So look, she's one of them. I think Labour MPs are beginning to understand the credibility problem they've got. I think that she might actually do with the issues over integrity and ethics over that stamp duty issue that are in play with the electorate. I think they might pause about putting her over the top, to kind of be one of the candidates that goes forward to the membership. There's a possibility they don't put her over the top. Who are the other figures? Well, there's her replacement as deputy leader of the Labour Party, Lucy Powell, a Mancunian-based constituency MP who's not actually a member of the government, was actually sacked by Sir Keir Starmer as leader of the House of Commons in a reshuffle, just as Angela Rayner, was kind of on her way out the door, and then won the deputy leadership shortly after. She has stayed out of government after winning that deputy leadership. She's very ambitious politically. Again, not a high flyer, not a particularly competent individual, not a great political communicator, not possessed of the sharpest judgment. There was an incident where she was, referring to Tim Montgomery's kind of concerns about the grooming gangs issue as a dog whistle, a little dog whistle. So yeah, she's another person that could well go for it. There's also David Lammy. Lammy is a greybeard in the sense that he's been around. He served in the last Labour government. That might count for something with some people. He's a contentious figure, to say the least, in terms of his politics, in terms of some of the very charged language he was using during the Brexit impasse about Leave voters and politicians who supported it, likening them to fascists and so forth. It played well with the base when he was a backbencher, an outspoken backbencher, but he's had to kind of walk back some of his things he said in the past, and there's no doubt other things that would come out if he went for a leadership contest, that probably would not play that well. Then you've got Ed Miliband, another kind of greybeard of the Blair and Brown era, who is not distinguishing himself well in the energy portfolio, energy and net zero portfolio. He obviously did have his tenure as Labour leader. He was the first, after Labour lost the 2010 general election, the first leader Labour had elected after that period. And, one of the things I would say about him is, he was tried and tested before the electorate and found wanting, very considerably wanting. It was not a good result for Labour under him. He's more remembered for the bacon roll image than for any of his particular policy kind of achievements as leader of the opposition in the sense of landing ideas. But he's become a zealot for the net zero cause, and his policies are likely to continue to worsen the UK's economic performance over the remainder of this parliament. It was said that Sir Keir Starmer was trying to move him out of that department as part of a reset to kind of move to a softer edged approach to some of these policies, and Ed flatly refused to move. So there is that dynamic of quite a lot of people who are already sort of tainted politically themselves in the eyes of the business community and of some of the voters, and just not seen as particularly competent. They're the kind of front runners. Now, look, there are one or two outsiders who could potentially go for this. Obviously, there's Andy Burnham, who's the mayor of Greater Manchester. He was recently blocked on an attempt to come in for the by-election in Gorton and Denton as Labour's candidate. He applied, and Sir Keir Starmer and the NEC blocked him because he'd been so open about wanting to play a role in the leadership, as he put it, of the Labour Party going forward and to correct the mistakes that have been made by the government. He's a direct rival to Sir Keir Starmer, but he's going to have difficulty getting in. And I don't think many of his, I don't think there'll be a clamour by the people that are lining up to sort of stand for this, for him to be allowed to stand, to be allowed to go for this, for any rule changes to let him stand, or to get him in on a by-election for a summer contest if it's in the summer. So he's kind of not really a factor in this as far as I can see right now, as the state of play looks. But there is another guy called Al Carnes. Now, Al Carnes is ex-UK military. He's another one of these kind of 2024 MPs who was sort of, I think, effectively sort of parachuted in without a proper parliamentary selection, as I understand it, in his patch. He was kind of effectively imposed by the leadership. A number of them who were quite close to Sir Keir Starmer. Now, Al is kind of playing up the everyman card, and there was sort of there was a picture of him that he tweeted out himself of enjoying a quiet pint as it was all kind of unfolding, a sort of go to the Winchester and wait for it all to cool down moment of levity. But he's being strongly speculated as somebody who they would like, a lot of backbenchers and some possibly even on the front bench would like to see put his name into the ring, because he's seen as a highly kind of competent figure who's not really scarred by the sort of the infighting of the Labour Party. Now, I don't really know a tremendous amount about him, but I get the feeling it's a little bit like when you get these kind of candidates who is a dark horse out of a field kind of candidates who are sort of propped up as the next big thing. I think there's an element of that going on, and possibly also a little bit of the sort of the empty vessel kind of dynamic of people saying, this guy looks photogenic, he's got a good track record, he'll play well with reform voters, let's get him in and we'll worry about the detail of what he actually believes in later. And funnily enough, it kind of reminds me a little bit of in 2019, when Dominic Raab was running, there were a lot of people on the right who were looking at what he'd said in the past and saying, this is fantastic, this is the guy we need. But then as soon as he kind of opened his mouth in that leadership contest, everything was very mealy-mouthed, very centrist, very sort of, having moved away from that radical small stater who believed in freedom, much more to a kind of Michael Gove continuity sort of Cameron kind of agenda. And, but people were ignoring that during the leadership contest because they were so desperate to get someone in who looked the part and had said things they found sound in the past. Maybe a little bit of that going on with him as well. So look, where does this all leave Labour? Well, in grave difficulty, I would say. Electorally, Reform are streaks ahead of them in most polls. I don't see that easily changing with a leadership change. I think Labour has been focusing on a number of the wrong policies. I had a tweet up about this, about the wrong priorities that are askew to the publics. I think a lot, even Labour voters would probably feel that, this obsession with free breakfast clubs at all state schools that they want to move towards, of rolling this out, particularly, state primary schools. Everybody should have a, state, who wants one should be able to kind of qualify for a free breakfast. These are not the priorities of the British people, frankly. A lot of people would say that's parental responsibility. Particularly even if you're on benefits, which a lot of people are, you should be able to feed your own children. Now, there's that. There's the, ending trial by jury. There's the stuff that they've done around the assisted dying bill, which is, a private member's bill technically, but the Labour Party overwhelmingly backs this thing. Parliamentary Labour Party, a significant proportion of them back it, and Keir Starmer clearly backs it. These have been their priorities, their obsession over the past year, these kind of policies that really just don't speak to voters as a major priority for a country that's clearly in quite serious trouble economically and is in social decline, and is dealing with pretty significant problems of disorder now. Um, Not the right priorities, and I just not sure that that's going to change with a leadership change necessarily. I don't think all the problems kind of sit at Keir Starmer's doorstep. I think it's his cabinet as a whole who've they're very misaligned. They're not really listening to what the public are telling them. They're just kind of doubling down, and that's why I think they're in quite significant trouble. They could potentially turn a new corner. It's not that likely that they are going to do that. I think, if anything, Labour are probably going to go more in a comfort zone direction towards somebody who takes them more to the left with sharper dividing lines against reform. And I suppose the Conservatives as well, but they're more of an afterthought really at this stage to Labour. This is the next general election is Labour versus Reform. That's the ball game. As far as Labour strategists generally feel. That's why the language has all moved to attacking Reform and Nigel Farage personally. They've got their work cut out for them if they're going to have a competitive offer and if they're going to be able to kind of show any real track record of social and economic revitalisation. It's very difficult to do from the position they found themselves in because they're structurally so the fiscal position is very difficult, and they're boxing themselves in with these tax rises that further chill investment and the tax yield and economic growth, and then they have to keep coming back. It's a very vicious cycle, and they keep breaking their words that this is it. We won't be coming back to tax you over here and you over here. They're flailing around. They're looking for quick wins and solutions, but they're not easy to come by. And that's if you haven't done the work in opposition. And this is a kind of a thought, really, a concluding thought for that's probably of interest to reformers. If you don't do the hard yards in opposition, if you don't really work out what you're for, what you're against, and what you're going to stop doing in government in order to do the new things you want to do, if you don't make the sums add up, and if you don't have an agenda that is primed for economic growth, that understands markets and free enterprise, then you're going to struggle. And that's what Reform has to learn from this debacle. That Labour came to power positioning themselves as the eggheads, positioning themselves as really smart, but actually it was all skin deep. It was, slogans about, world-class technical education, slogans about the growth engines that they were going to build, and about new national missions for economic growth, with no detail, no real thought about what they were going to liberalise in the economy, because they didn't want to liberalise much to get things done. No coherence that if you want to pursue AI, this AI opportunities action plan that they are trumpeting as this is the future of economic growth. If you want to pursue that, you can do that, but only if you actually have a serious energy policy. And you can't do that while you're pursuing nutso net zero agendas around the clean energy transition that just are not. They're not consistent with having a serious policy for energy abundance because they're unreliable sources. And so you kind of leave yourself stuttering and having to kind of keep buying oil and gas from abroad when there's shortfalls. Labour have got to make changes if they want to be competitive, but Reform has also got to learn from Labour's mistakes to really do the homework in opposition. Anyway, that's all from me. I hope you've enjoyed the episode, and do subscribe and share if you like it. Thank you very much.